gender as being the social meanings and expectations that we have that we place upon sex, which we believe are the biological differences. And that therefore gender is this socially constructed thing. Again, very real and very important, but ultimately something that we socially do in the world. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean there's no biological differences between human beings and among human beings. There are. And as I also said, everybody likes the word gender because then they don't have to say sex. So if you're a polite person, you're like, oh, I want to say gender. But when we're looking at skeletons, people that are dead and half rotted away, what are we looking at? What are we going to be able to determine for measuring a skeleton, Eric? Huh? Well, if we have a pelvic zone, sure, that's a good place to look. But what are we trying to find out from that? What will we be able to determine from that pelvic zone? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, when we look at a skeleton is going to be the sex determination. We won't be able to say anything from the skeleton about how that individual identified socially or genderally, you know what I mean? So it's, who knows? Who knows what that person was like during life? We might know, but we might not know. We might have a skull, we might not have a skull. We might just have pelvis or something, archaeologically speaking. It's always nice to have skulls, but sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So, with that being said, I want to first talk about the fact that because gender is a social idea, you could actually have more than two social genders. Now, this may not be as hard to wrap our minds around as some of the other stuff we'll be talking about. We may be able to do this or figure this out a little bit better, which is that we think of gender as coming only in two. But in other societies, that may not necessarily be the case. So there's a couple of sort of very famous examples of this. The hijras in Hindu ritual and in India, people who are, for the most part, biologically male, but take on a special social role, which is outside of the gender idea, outside of the two genders. And then another actually, this occurs in various ways in Indigenous or Native American societies in both North America and South America, I would say, throughout the Americas. The idea that someone can be what many groups or tribes, but not all, have referred to these as kind of two-spirit persons. People who might be, so some of them are like a third gender idea, people who might be biologically male, but take on the social characteristics of a female, or play a special ritual role which is outside of the gender system, or people who are biologically female who take on the characteristics of men or play a special role. So socially speaking, and this doesn't necessarily involve any kind of biological transformation or difference, but socially speaking, there have been many examples all over the world and throughout time of people who had more than two social genders in the world. The Native American one is particularly interesting. It was pretty prevalent, especially in kind of the Northeast in our region of the world. The missionaries from Europe did not like this at all. And so a lot of the people who were, for one thing, that it was derogatorily named by, especially by the French colonizers. They called this this practice berdache, which was basically a derogatory word for a French male prostitute. So that's how it came into the anthropological literature with this kind of derogatory word. And plus, people were very interested in stamping out these customs and making sure that Native Americans were conforming to the ideology of Christianity. And so it's only in recent years that some of these practices have come back. But like I said, these are very, we tend to think of ourselves as just now trying to figure out gender, but these are very ancient and old ideas in different parts of the world. They do not correspond necessarily to what people are doing today, but in many indigenous groups and in many societies, there are all over the world different examples of people who have 3 genders or maybe more. So that's, I think most of us can understand how socially people could be considered outside of a gender binary. But more than that, people began to ask, probably about, I don't know, I'm thinking about 30 years ago or so, whether our gender binary, that is our social ideas, are what make us insist that there's a biological sex binary, that people only come in 2 categories biologically speaking. Actually, Sophia, you kind of got to this in your comment a little bit. What is it we think now about gender that we might start thinking about sex? So, I mean, this idea is that, we've sort of, I think, like I said, we're sort of more comfortable with the idea that socially speaking, our ideas about gender are more fluid. But the question is, have we thus been misinterpreting the sex record, the biological characteristics because of that? And so this article is about, well, Jalen, what happened to those skeletons in archaeology? What did people classify them as, kind of default to? Yeah, so basically there was a kind of an overclassification of the skeletons in archaeology, like 12% more males than females, which is, was obviously sort of wrong, but people were, that was the default. If you couldn't figure it out, you just said male. So that was one thing that people said, hey, wait a second, this is weird. Why are we classifying people automatically as male? The other thing that was happening in some ways, I think especially during the 1950s and 60s, you might say, is that if someone was born with ambiguous genitalia, they sort of quickly whisk the person off, huddle, make a decision, and then operate and do a sort of surgical procedure. And in some cases, that is probably, appropriate. There are certain anomalies, you might say, which are kind of more obvious than others. But some people in what is now the intersex community say, hey, wait a second, we shouldn't be automatically operating and performing surgery on people who don't have a chance to kind of develop and do that. So like I said, I think there was a little bit of an urge to shove people into our 2 categories by doing surgery on them as soon as they were born. The other thing that was happening especially during the 1980s and 1990s, is that we started to, like I said, with the gender reveal party, we started looking for the sex of the infant long before the infant is even born. And this is a very different thing that happened in human history before the ultrasound. It's hard to imagine this, but for example, in the 1950s and 60s, people used to buy, or women that were pregnant used to buy twin insurance. And basically, twin insurance was that if you had twins, then you'd get an extra bassinet and an extra everything. And so people would actually give birth and then find out they had twins. It's hard for us to imagine this today because obviously we know that much earlier on because of the ultrasound, but that was how unexpected things could be. So you certainly didn't know what sex of a baby you were going to have. But nowadays, you may notice you have the gender reveal party, you paint up the nursery, you buy a bunch of clothes of the appropriate gender ideology, and there you're off to the races before the kid is even born. You're already set. And I sometimes think that maybe we wouldn't be so like hung up on gender if our babies weren't coming out into pink rooms the second they're born and have a whole set of different diapers and stuff. It's gotten weird that way. So all of these things made us in some ways, or caused people to wonder about if our social ideas were influencing our sex ideas. The other thing that I want to point out is that even though we do separate the social gender expectations from the biological, that when we expect people to do different things or behave in different ways, we can give them different things. Now, in the old days, I hope this doesn't happen as much anymore, but in the old days, we actually fed boys and girls differently. That is to say, the boys and the men got the protein, they got the meat, because they were the ones who were expected to be doing, hard labor jobs outside the household, whereas the girls got sugars and carbs because they were not being expected to do that. So they, if you can imagine being raised on protein versus sugars and carbs is going to have a different biological outcome than because of our social expectations. The other thing that we still see today, or hopefully not as much, but certainly still true, is differences in expectations about physical activity, what kind of sports, what kind of training you'll get, and what kind of things that you are channeled into. And so they've done studies, for example, you can't tell boys and girls apart, at least if they're clothed and when they're infants. So they'll take a baby, dress the baby in blue pants and stuff, and hand a person this baby, and you tell it's a boy. And if you tell the person it's a boy, they'll be like throwing it around and jostling it up and doing all this stuff. But if you put it in the same baby in pink, give it a little frill, give it a little dress, they'll be like calming it down and cooing over it and won't be throwing it around as much, even though it's the same baby. And, as some of you know from the recent experience of the NCAA women's basketball team, they'll go to the hotel and the guys will have this like full weight room to work out in, and the girls will have like a couple of dumbbells here, and it won't be equal. Like I said, hopefully we're getting better at that, but it's still, to this day, there's a channeling of different expectations about who plays what. And also, we talked about this in the last class about occupations, how we work, what kinds of expectations we have for the kinds of bodies that will go into these kinds of labor. Now, I mentioned this to say that because our ideas about gender can also influence how we treat people and create or emphasize different biological differences. Now, let's turn to the actual biology of this and the sex differentiation. I would say that most of us have been taught that there are two different chromosomal categories, and that's it. it's not quite as simple as that. And it's not that there's a tremendous number of people like this, but many people live out their lives as either male or female and don't even know that they might be XXY or XYY or XXX. So there can be, like, triples on the sex chromosomes. And for some people that creates some differences. There's certain syndromes that are associated with these chromosomals, but for some people it really doesn't make a difference and they never know. The one that, well, Kendra, you were a little bit curious about this one. The XY athlete in this thing seemed a little strange, right? Yeah, I'd have to say, every time I do this, I definitely go down a little rabbit hole to see, like, wait a second, what? How can this be? So this time I looked up, and sure enough, there's been a Danish study that was put out a couple of years ago. It's a strange title. More women than expected are genetically men. So basically, there are some instances in which people are XY chromosomally, but the Y isn't doing, how to say, the Y isn't doing, I don't want to say what it should be doing. It's just not, it's not doing all the stuff. And so the male sex organs either don't develop or they might be internal. So this has a range. Some people are XY, classified as female, but actually have high testosterone levels and basically, I don't know, it's too early in the morning for this, but internal testicles, let's put it that way. And so that's like one extreme where it's like from the outside, and so that would be one extreme. On the other extreme, there are XY people who actually have a uterus and have given birth. So I mean, it can be that extreme too. So it's kind of, there's a different range here. It's more than expected. It's not a ton, but it's, it's more than expected. This led to one of the most famous people, which is cited in the article that we read, is Anne Fausto Sterling's article from 1993 called "The Five Sexes: Why Male and Female Are Not Enough." And this gets cited a lot. And the idea was, well, actually, biologically speaking, maybe we shouldn't necessarily group people into just male and female. Maybe there's five. And one of the things that gets cited from these studies is a relatively, I guess I would say, a higher percentage than we'd expect of people who might have some sort of intersex condition. Cheyenne, were you struck by this number, the percentage here? Do you remember what it was? Pretty high. I mean, I think that would be a pretty high number, 1.7%, right? I mean, that's quite a few of us then, So, this article is, a pretty interesting take on how, if we do gender along a spectrum, maybe we should do sex the same way. And we have, our XY athlete who apparently lived her life out as female, was chromosomally XY, probably didn't know. And it was only after dying that they determined this, and then said, we're going to take those medals away because she was XY. So, it's definitely an interesting case. They talk here about the pelvis, and like I said, it's probably too early in the morning to be staring at pelvises, but we're going to try here. I guess I would say that a lot of people believe, maybe a lot of guys, believe that there's like a huge difference between the male and female pelvis, because where do you put the stuff that guys have, right? I mean, you must have something to hang it on. But you don't. That's the crazy thing. There's nothing there that like, there's nothing that tells you that there's going to be testicles and a penis hanging off somewhere. There's nothing to hang it on to, skeletally speaking. So every semester when I assign this article, I then ask a multiple choice question, which says, what is the difference? And one of my answers is, they are clearly distinguished by a genital ridge. There's no such thing as a genital ridge. I just made that up. But you would be surprised how many students want to believe that. And they say, yes, there must be a freaking genital ridge. Obviously, that needs something. But there's not. If you notice from this, the other answer I put in there is that the female pelvis has to be 17 times wider in order to give birth. You'd be surprised at how many students check that one off too. It's like, oh yeah, I think I heard that somewhere. Now it is true that if you're giving birth, it's not easy. They don't call it labor. I mean, they call it labor for a reason. You do have to dilate that out to 10 centimeters, and it's pretty intense. But it'll come back together. And if you do give birth, your skeleton will, it'll be more obvious. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, most of the time, yeah, there's some wider and narrowness to this, but really it's subtle, and there's overlap between these things. So anyway, don't get confused by the genital ridge or the 17 times. Yeah, narrow, wide, but not as easy as you think. Some of you know, if you have a skull around, that can help. Certainly might make it easier. So once we figured that one out, one of the nice things that can happen is that you can correct those archaeological ratios. And Stephanie, what else might we want to do if we are measuring all those pelvises and stuff that aren't sure? Absolutely. So correcting our biases, and we don't need to have everything classified. If we don't know, we can leave it as indeterminate. And that's increasingly becoming common because you don't have enough information, and you certainly don't know, like we said, gender. So there's been a recognition of biological messiness, that variation occurs and is important. I think, like I said, there's a little bit less emphasis on trying to fix people that might not conform to certain rules. And I think in this was an article that came out about a year ago by the biological anthropologist Agustin Fuentes, who's been very active on some of these issues. And he wrote that biological science rejects the sex binary, and that's good for humanity. That there's diverse ways of being male, female, or both. Embracing these truths will help humans flourish. So everything seemed great, recognizing that people overlap, and you can have different ways of being a guy and different ways of being female and different ways of doing both or neither. Everything's fine and we're all going to flourish. But then there's a little bit of a backlash. Basically, after Fuentes put out this article, I don't know what exactly happened. I can't really trace this, but there's been a counter movement. There's been people who have really jumped on people like Agustin Fuentes and been like, no way. And so he's basically, if he gets ratioed all the time, if he publishes an article, all of a sudden all these people are like, no way. And so he had to put out like, hey man, you're not going to be able to contact me because I'm just getting flooded with crap. My personal favorite response to this was by this person who I don't know. You drank a Kool-Aid loaded with political leftist laxatives. This guy teaches at Princeton. It's a travesty that higher education is brainwashing our youth to believe this stuff, contributing to the demise of our country. I'm thinking, man, do you know how much it would be nice if I could brainwash the youth of our country? I can't even get them to come to class, man, let alone brainwash them. I have trouble just getting them to do the readings. So anyway, but I think it's worth looking at this and what's going on. So I'm not going to try to brainwash you, but I am going to give you my take on this debate because, you know. So anyway, this is my take. So for one thing, if you remember Anne Fausto Sterling's article, The 5 Sexes, Why Male and Female Are Not Enough, it was so popular that she did a follow-up article called The 5 Sexes Revisited. I should say somewhat so popular and so controversial. But one of the things that she wrote in there was kind of, how to say, she says, well, I intended to be provocative, but I had also written with tongue firmly in cheek. Now, one of the things that we might not understand is if somebody says they're writing or they're talking to you with their tongue in their cheek, you know what that means? We use that. I don't think anybody uses this expression anymore. So nobody would know. If I said, yeah, I was tongue in cheek, would you have any idea what I was saying? Yeah, bud.
It's kind of just like it's kind of like being like it's like kind of like beating around the bush.
No, beating around the bush is beating around the bush. We still have that one. If I say, yeah, I was tongue in cheek, what should you, Maeve, what do you got? You're being cheeky. I mean, yeah. So basically the definition of tongue in cheek is good because, like I said, people in my generation still use this word, we use this phrase like we think we know what people, it means that you were somewhat joking but appearing to be serious. All right, so you're playing it straight, but you're still somewhat joking. So you're like, I was tongue in cheek. Now, this is kind of a weird thing to say about the 5 sexes. Wait, are you saying you're somewhat joking but pretending to be serious? Because I was taking that seriously, right? So it's like, wait a second. There was also a tiny bit, well, there's been, remember that 1.7% intersex, which, like I said, it would have been a lot. That's a lot of people. 1.7% is like almost 2%. That's a lot. And so this other person said, well, wait a second. If intersex has any meaning, it has to be when chromosomal sex is inconsistent with phenotypic sex, or in which the phenotype is not classifiable as male or female, and so it's 0.018%. Now that is a huge difference. Does it mean it's 1.7 out of every 100 people or 1.8 out of every 10,000 people? Right? That's a pretty big difference. And just to put it in kind of terms for us that can't think statistically, are we talking about 20 people at Hartwick College? Or are we talking about 2 people in all of Oneonta, including Hartwick, SUNY, and the whole town? Right? That's a pretty huge difference. My own take on this is that it's not as tiny as 2, and it's not as big as 1.7%. It's a little bit, tend to go a little bit on the lower side, but I don't think it's that low. Anyway, like I said, this is my take. So we talked in a class that some biological variation is completely gradual. Skin color. We could line everybody up in the world, and there's no line between skin colors, either in abstractly lined up or even geographically lined up from like town to town. And so we call this in biological gradual variation, this is clinal, because there's no binary, there's no line that you can draw. Human sex variation is not, there's lots of overlap. There's like tall women, short guys, strong women, weak guys. You know, there's lots of variation in hips and all that stuff. And there's a lot of overlap, but there's also some average differences. And so, you know, unlike skin color, there are, I think somebody put it bimodal, there are basically two groups that you can sort people into. So I think that in some ways, you know, this idea that it's just all along a spectrum, skin color is a spectrum. It's clinal all the way through. Biological sex is more bimodal with some differences, some, I don't want to say anomalies, but something different. And I'm going to say that, you know, that I don't know about the athlete that we read about. Apparently she was XY, but didn't have high levels of testosterone. But there are some athletes, there's a couple of very famous runners who have run at times in the female category, but basically are chromosomally male and have male levels of testosterone, but with what is called difference in sex development. So their sex organs did not develop as male, but in some ways their levels are pretty male. And, you know, I think because of the way our sports competition is organized, for me, it seems a little bit, I don't know. I don't think that's completely, you know, if you're chromosomally and testosteronally male, it doesn't seem right to be competing in the female category. Yeah, Sophia. I guess that's why I'm saying in some sports against some individuals. So, you know, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, this is my take, and I wouldn't want to make a hard and fast rule about this because this happens differently in different people. But I guess I would say sometimes. And in part, well, I mean, part of it is that some of the sports that we have were actually designed to showcase male muscles and male stuff. And so, you know, I mean, if our sports had been designed to showcase female stuff and female muscles, we'd have very different sports outcomes and these kinds of things. But there are some sports like the 800-meter run is really, you know, I mean, there's at the elite level, the fastest in the world are males, and none of the females would be able to compete in that. And so to put someone has the same sort of pretty biologically male characteristics in an 800-meter, for example, is not really fair to XX people. Like I said, I don't want to make a hard and fast rule about that. So my other position on this is that, you know, I think that binary from a scientific way, I like bimodal though, I like that, Sophia, I'm glad you said that. But binary scientifically might be technically correct for how sex works. But when we ourselves outside of science, it's kind of like the word theory outside of science. When we use it, we often imply that there's some sort of clear separation or that there's some sort of antagonism or competition. And so the reality of biology is that we do have sexual dimorphism between males and females, but we also share and recombine our genes all the time. And so we can't get that dimorphic. Now, like I said, this is a little bit biologically complicated, but it was very well explained in these 3 tweets from a real biologist. So when this whole debate, it's still going on, when the whole Twitter backlash was going on about, you know, sex is a binary or not, this biologist said something that I think was pretty important, although I'm not a biologist, so I don't understand it all. He says that it's exactly the phenotype distribution is what we expect, given that males and females share a common gene pool in recombination. So we do have sexual dimorphism and differences in males and females and some average weight, height, strength differences, right? But the other thing is that all of our alleles get recombined and spend 50% of its evolutionary lifetime in the bodies of each sex. So you have both sexual dimorphism and specific selections based on sex, but you also have this recombining gene pool. And so from his point of view, biologists and non-biologists, those of you who fall into either of those categories, a lot of these things, I think what he is saying is that sex is binary or sex is a continuum are both these kinds of extreme slogans. And the reality is kind of a lot is dimorphism constrained by our shared evolutionary recombination. And so the science of this is perhaps messier than either side wants it to, or messier than the sexes binary side wants it to be, but not as continuous variation as the other folks want it to be. So, like I said, I'm not, I don't, you can do your own research on this. I'm not trying to brainwash you. My own views have shifted a little bit over the years, back and forth, but that's where I kind of see things now in terms of our approach to this. One of the things that this biologist says is that some of these things that people get excited about, get very up in arms about today, hopefully if we can think about them, they fade away and become meaningless. That is to say, we recognize that they're not as clear cut, or we don't have to be fighting each other about them. Which leads us to our article for Wednesday, which will be about imagining different futures, about ways that we can think about how these differences might fade out and become less important.